Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mekra Al channel. Today we're going to take a detailed look at the Season 3 trailer of House of the Dragon. The trailer gives us several striking scenes that strongly hint at major turning points in the story. In addition, the showrunners and directors have made some interesting statements, and by combining their comments with what we see in the footage, we can start building a clearer picture of what might unfold this season. If you'd like to support the channel, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps. Before we dive in, I need to give you a serious spoiler warning. In this video, we'll be discussing some of the most important events that could take place in Season 3. We'll also be referencing details from the book to strengthen our analysis. So if you want to avoid heavy spoilers, this is your chance to click away. Now, when you first watch the trailer, it looks absolutely epic, visually stunning and packed with intensity. But we have to remember that this season will consist of only 8 episodes. The trailer itself runs about a minute and a half, and realistically, there's roughly 1 minute of meaningful footage to analyze. Predicting the direction of an entire season based on such limited material is never easy. We've seen this before. In previous seasons, early trailers sometimes made certain moments look far bigger or very different from how they ultimately played out. So instead of jumping to conclusions, let's carefully break down what we've been shown and explore what it might actually mean for Season 3. That being said, there are 2 things I feel relatively confident about. One of them is the Battle of the Gullet. From the way it's being set up, it seems like it could be handled quite effectively. As you know, in the original story there are 5 dragons involved in that battle. The big question is whether we'll actually see all of them on screen. Will every dragon appear? Will they fully commit to showing that scale? I'm not entirely sure. Then there are Rhaenyra's sons. Viserys and Aegon are still very young at this stage of the story, and in the book there are major events involving their capture and captivity. Will the series adapt those moments faithfully? That's something we still don't know. There's also the matter of characters like Nettles, who appears in the book but seems to have been removed from the show. If that's the case, could her narrative role be given to Rhaena instead? These kinds of changes raise important questions about how closely the series will follow the source material. The battle itself is meant to be enormous. In interviews and promotional material, they keep emphasizing how massive and epic it will be. But we have to acknowledge that a lot of that is part of the marketing strategy. Every season is promoted as bigger and more spectacular than the last. Ultimately, the real question is whether we'll truly see the scale described in the book. Can they realistically deliver that level of spectacle? We're talking about a naval battle involving 5 or 6 dragons. If this were purely a land battle, that would already be ambitious. But adding a large-scale sea battle on top of that makes it far more technically demanding. So while it certainly has the potential to be incredible, whether they can fully realize that vision is something we'll have to wait and see. Beyond that, I also believe we'll see a major land battle this season. I'm not entirely sure how they plan to structure it though. As you know, in Fire and Blood, there are multiple battles during the Dance of the Dragons. My guess is that the show might merge several of those engagements into a single large-scale battlefield confrontation. And, honestly, that would be understandable. Portraying every single battle separately would be extremely expensive. From a production standpoint, combining them into one major event would make sense. What really matters, at least for me, and I think for most viewers, is that the key events themselves aren't fundamentally altered. That said, I believe both the land battle and the naval battle will likely be well received by general audiences. However, what happens in between those large-scale conflicts will ultimately define how we judge the season as a whole, and that includes major turning points such as the fall of King's Landing and Rhaenyra finally taking the Iron Throne. If we consider how slow-paced Season 2 was, it would be frustrating if Rhaenyra's capture of King's Landing were pushed all the way to the season finale. In the book, the Battle of the Gullet is followed fairly quickly by Rhaenyra and Daemon moving toward King's Landing. If the pacing remains faithful to that structure, we might actually see the Battle of the Gullet as early as the first episode. If that happens, it would significantly change the tempo of the season. That's why I believe they need to move toward King's Landing sooner rather than later. In my opinion, several episodes this season should actually take place in King's Landing. That shift in setting is crucial for maintaining momentum. Under normal circumstances, both the Battle of the Gullet and the fall of King's Landing were originally expected to happen in Season 2. The initial plan was reportedly for a 10-episode season, with the Battle of the Gullet in Episode 9 and the fall of King's Landing in Episode 10. If that structure had remained intact, I genuinely believe Season 2 could have been extraordinary. Instead, by delaying those major events, the season inevitably lost some of its impact. Now that both of these pivotal moments have been pushed into Season 3, the big question becomes, will we still get other large-scale battles this season? For example, the first Battle of Tumbleton, in my view, absolutely needs to happen in Season 3. If they postpone it again, the timeline starts to feel overcrowded. Season 4 is already expected to include massive events such as the storming of the Dragon Pit, the confrontation between Daemon and Aemond, and potentially even the Second Battle of Tumbleton. These are monumental, high-stakes moments. Fitting all of that into a single season would be incredibly ambitious. That's why I'm concerned. Realistically, they may not be able to include everything. And if something has to be sacrificed, I worry that the first Battle of Tumbleton could be the one we never get to see. There's only so much budget and screen time available, especially when multiple large-scale battles, dragons, and major character arcs are involved. At this point, all we can really do is wait and see how they decide to balance it all. Now, without speaking in overly broad terms any longer, I want to finally start breaking down the trailer itself. Interestingly, the trailer picks up exactly where the series left off. Right at the end of Season 2, we see Alicent arriving in King's Landing, and at the same time, we see Aemond sitting on the Iron Throne. He asks her where she has been. In that same moment, he says something along the lines of, "Rhaenyra will come here eventually, and she will come with her dragons." This moment opens up several possibilities. We might see Aemond preparing to leave King's Landing shortly after this. Perhaps Alicent confesses that she met with Rhaenyra and tells him that her arrival is inevitable. If that happens, Aemond might decide not to remain in the capital. Instead, he could leave, possibly heading toward Harrenhal, or even further depending on how the show chooses to adapt it. Now, in the book, Aemond doesn't exactly run away. That isn't how it's framed. However, since the show already introduced the idea of Aemond withdrawing or repositioning strategically in Season 2, they could lean into that interpretation again here. We also see a scene where Rhaenyra is speaking to Jace. She tells him, "You cannot trust her." The question is, who is she referring to? It could be Alicent. It could be Mysaria. Most likely, though, it's Alicent. This brings us to a very important structural issue. How does the fall of King's Landing actually happen in the book? First, the Battle of the Gullet takes place. After that, Aemond and Criston Cole march with their forces toward Harrenhal. Their goal is simple: eliminate Daemon and effectively end the war. In Aemond's mind, Daemon is the true backbone of the Blacks. If Daemon falls, Rhaenyra's cause collapses. However, what they fail to realize is that Daemon, through his network of spies within King's Landing, is fully aware of their movements and their plans. While Aemond and Criston believe they are making a decisive offensive move, Daemon and Rhaenyra are quietly preparing a counter-strategy. Instead of confronting them directly, they take advantage of the capital being left vulnerable. With Aemond and much of the military force away, King's Landing is exposed. Thanks to Daemon's continued influence over the Goldcloaks, who remain loyal to him, the gates of the city are opened with little resistance. And just like that, the Blacks secure one of their most significant victories. It's a brilliant strategic maneuver in the book, less about brute force, more about intelligence and timing. The question now is whether the show will follow this structure faithfully or choose to modify it for dramatic effect. We've also seen the Hightower Army again. When earlier promotional images were released, we discussed their possible involvement. What role will they actually play? Especially considering leaked footage suggested Daemon may have some form of interaction or negotiation with Hightower forces. This season, Daemon appears poised to be everywhere, in King's Landing, on the battlefield against the Hightower Army. His presence seems central across multiple fronts. If handled correctly, this could easily become one of his most impactful seasons. But then we have even more to consider: the Battle of the Gullet, the conflicts in the Riverlands, the involvement of the Starks and the Winter Wolves, and the inevitable confrontation with the Lannister forces. How are they going to balance all of this? That's the real challenge. There are simply so many major conflicts and political shifts happening simultaneously. Pulling them together in a coherent, well-paced way will determine whether Season 3 feels monumental or overcrowded. At this point, the scale is massive. The question is whether the structure will be strong enough to support it. The reason this becomes complicated is because there are simply too many armies in play. You have the Crown's forces, you have the Lannister army, you have the army Daemon has gathered in the Riverlands. The Winter Wolves and Stark forces are entering the conflict. And on top of that, the Hightower army is advancing as well. So the big question becomes, how are these factions going to align? Will the Hightowers and the Lannisters unite and fight together against the Blacks? Or will the Lannisters instead combine forces with Criston Cole's army, forcing Daemon to confront them? Or perhaps Daemon will face only the Lannisters in a more contained battle? At this point, it's unclear. My personal guess is that Daemon will most likely end up fighting primarily against the Lannisters. Another possibility is that the Lannisters and Cole's forces merge, creating a larger unified threat. But then another major question arises: where is Aemond in all of this? If this is such a pivotal battlefield moment, why wouldn't Aemond be present? And interestingly, we don't seem to see Daemon on Dragonback in these specific battle glimpses either. That absence is intriguing. Why wouldn't he be mounted if this is meant to be a large-scale confrontation? As for the High Towers, I'm not entirely convinced they'll be present in this particular open field battle. Their involvement may be more strategic or political, rather than direct in that specific engagement. We also see Aegon alongside Larys, and in one scene, Aegon appears to be stabbing someone. After the fall of King's Landing, Aegon's storyline in the book becomes rather dark and somewhat mysterious. Much of it is revealed later, after Rhaenyra eventually loses the city and returns to Dragonstone. We're told that Aegon hides for a time, possibly disguised as a commoner, even as a fisherman, but the details are never fully explored. The show seems to be taking a different approach. Instead of removing Aegon from the narrative for an extended period, they may be crafting a more active, visible journey for him. And honestly, I don't think that's necessarily a bad choice. After all, he was king. If he were to simply vanish from the story for an entire season, potentially not reappearing until the end of season 4, that would be a bold and risky storytelling decision. It could have worked, but it's understandable why the showrunners might not want to sideline such a central character for that long. Ultimately, what matters most is whether the new storyline they create for him is compelling and well written. If they expand his arc in a meaningful way, it could add depth rather than detract from the source material. Now we just have to hope the execution lives up to the ambition. There was also that leaked audio clip. In it, we hear Aegon Targaryen proclaiming his full royal titles and saying something along the lines of, "At last you see me. I am anger. I am power." It's a very intense, almost theatrical declaration. That speech could very well take place during his journey with Larys, perhaps in response to a challenge or confrontation they face along the way. We'll have to wait and see how that context plays out. One thing that stood out to me, though, is that we still haven't properly seen Daeron in the trailer. At this point, I genuinely think they should have revealed him already. How long can you keep something like this under wraps? Images are already circulating online. People are speculating constantly. This is Daeron. No, that's Daeron, and so on. If he's part of the story, just show him. What exactly are they trying to preserve as a surprise? Why is Daeron being treated like some massive secret? What makes his introduction so crucial that it has to be delayed or framed as a dramatic reveal? There were also those so-called leaked scenes where people claimed Daeron was being shown, only for it to turn out that the character wasn't actually him. The whole situation around Daeron has been strangely overcomplicated, and I'm not entirely sure why. Then there's Tessarion. I've seen some criticism about the dragon's design, people saying they're not impressed. Personally, I'm not overly bothered by it. In the book, Tessarion isn't portrayed as one of the most dominant or defining dragons compared to others. She plays an important role, yes, but she's not at the same level of narrative centrality as some of the larger dragons. Is the design extraordinary? I wouldn't say it's mind-blowing, but at the end of the day, it's a dragon. And, visually, it still works. We also see Vhagar, and by extension, Aemond, in what appears to be a ruined castle. This is most likely Harrenhal, and if the adaptation follows the book closely, Daemon will eventually leave, and the infamous Strong massacre will likely take place. Simon Strong, who became one of the most unexpectedly charming characters of Season 2, is brutally killed in the book. I'm very curious to see how they handle that on screen. In the source material, Aemond doesn't just eliminate his enemies, he wipes out the Strong line without hesitation. Will they portray that same level of brutality here? From what we glimpse in the trailer, it certainly looks possible. It's not entirely clear who we're seeing die in those burning scenes, but there's a strong chance they are members of House Strong. Perhaps even Simon's sons, the ones we briefly saw earlier, could be among the victims. It's possible they won't dedicate a long, detailed sequence to each individual death, and instead show a more collective execution, gathering them together and burning them all at once. Personally, I wouldn't want it to be rushed like that. Season 2 left Aemond with significant narrative space, and this would be the perfect opportunity to fully explore his psychological descent, to really show his ruthlessness and instability in a visceral way. A darker, more intense scene could add serious weight to his character arc. As for the Battle of the Gullet, I plan to analyze all of those scenes together at the end, because I truly believe it will be the defining event of the season. We also see Criston Cole, and given the circumstances, he may be visiting a town or settlement after Vhagar's devastation in the Riverlands. It's possible this scene is meant to highlight Cole's evolving role in the Dance of the Dragons. In the grand scheme of the story, his influence gradually becomes smaller compared to the dragons and the larger political forces at play. Perhaps this portrayal subtly reflects that, symbolizing how limited his impact ultimately becomes. And if that was intentional, I actually think it's a smart and effective choice. Of course, whether that interpretation is accurate is open to debate. After all, Criston Cole rises from practically nothing to become Hand of the King. In Westeros, that kind of resume is extremely rare. Very few characters climb from such humble origins to one of the most powerful political positions in the realm. So to say his role in this story is small might not be entirely fair. Now, I'll admit, my personal dislike of Cole might make me enjoy downplaying him. But if we look objectively at what he accomplishes with the opportunities he's given, you could argue he actually plays one of the most significant roles in the entire conflict. Let's be honest, the man essentially comes from obscurity, from a minor Dornish background, and ends up becoming Hand of the King during the height of Targaryen power. That's not insignificant. You can say it happened because Aegon was foolish. You can argue it wasn't purely Cole's brilliance, but history is full of incompetent rulers who still became kings. What you rarely see is a common-born knight rising to that level of influence and authority. So I'm not entirely sure how I ended up defending Criston Cole here when I usually criticize him. But credit where credit is due. Now, this particular scene also received criticism, especially regarding Caraxes' posture and the CGI quality. Personally, I assume some of that will be refined before final release. And honestly, I'm not overly concerned. How many television series even attempt this level of dragon warfare? Massive battles, multiple dragons, large-scale destruction. If one CGI shot isn't perfect, that's the least of my concerns. I would much rather have an incredible story with the occasional imperfect visual effect than a flawless CGI scene attached to weak writing. That said, there are valid concerns about scale. Some viewers pointed out that Caraxes appears smaller here than he did in Season 1. When Daemon wrote him before, he looked absolutely massive, almost overwhelming in size. In this scene, he appears more compact, and Daemon seems more visible on his back. Why the inconsistency? I genuinely don't know. Considering how particular fans are about dragon sizes and continuity, you'd think this would be something the production team would monitor carefully. Yet, we keep seeing these scale fluctuations, and it's puzzling. In the end, though, while visual continuity matters, the storytelling still outweighs everything else. If the emotional and narrative beats land properly, minor CGI inconsistencies won't ruin the experience. In the trailer, we see the Iron Throne guards drawing their swords and charging forward, and toward the very end of the trailer, it looks like Daemon is fighting one of them, possibly inside the throne room itself. This is exactly why I said earlier that Alicent may not be the one who successfully opens the gates. Because if she truly opened the gates in an attempt to prevent bloodshed, it would make little sense for Rhaenyra to storm into the throne room and immediately order her soldiers to slaughter everyone. That wouldn't align with the idea of a peaceful surrender. But then another thought crossed my mind. What if Rhaenyra, after Jacaery's death, reaches a breaking point? What if she arrives at King's Landing already emotionally shattered? And even if Alicent opens the gates, Rhaenyra still allows or even orders violence inside the city. Would they go that route? Would they lean into a Daenerys 2.0 inches storyline? Another descent into madness? And more importantly, would that even make sense within this context? To be fair, in the book once the gates are opened, Rhaenyra and Daemon do eliminate those who resist. That's normal in a medieval-style conquest. Soldiers who fight back are killed. But that's very different from indiscriminate slaughter after a surrender. The key difference here is that the show has altered the setup. If Alicent is the one facilitating the gates being opened, especially after expressing a desire to prevent further bloodshed, it would feel contradictory if Rhaenyra immediately turned the city into a massacre. Unless, of course, Alicent doesn't actually have full control over the soldiers, perhaps figures like Gwaine Hightower intervene. Maybe the Hightower loyalists refuse to stand down, leading to violence despite the surrender. Or, as I mentioned before, perhaps Rhaenyra arrives in a far darker emotional state than we expect. Maybe Jace's death pushes her toward harsher decisions. At the same time, there were leaked or shared scenes suggesting Rhaenyra and Alicent interact after the city falls, and in those glimpses, their dynamic didn't appear openly hostile. It seemed tense but controlled. So if that's accurate, it makes a full massacre less likely. In the end, this moment is crucial. How they handle the fall of King's Landing, whether it's strategic, restrained, brutal, or chaotic, will define how we interpret Rhaenyra's character moving forward. And that's why this scene carries so much weight. If Alicent truly witnesses a massacre carried out by Rhaenyra's forces, and yet still maintains some level of understanding or cooperation with her afterward, I honestly don't know how that would work. Alicent has already sacrificed so much. She's essentially distanced herself from nearly everyone except her daughter. At this point, would she really overlook something like that? Then again, perhaps she would. There's also that shot in the trailer where Alicent looks completely horrified, genuinely shocked. That reaction could very well be tied to the brutal killing of her household guards, or perhaps even to the death of her brother. Either scenario would explain that expression. Now, let's move on to the Battle of the Gullet. As you'll remember, in Season 2, Tywin Lannister traveled to secure an alliance with the Triarchy, the Kingdom of the Three Daughters. He successfully convinced them to join the war, and they began sailing with their combined fleet, alongside ships from the Free Cities, toward Dragonstone. At the same time, the Blacks were preparing their own offensive toward King's Landing. In the book, however, what follows is a devastating surprise assault. The Triarchy launches a major attack on both Dragonstone and Driftmark. It's not just a skirmish, it's a brutal naval confrontation that leaves lasting consequences. Corlys Velaryon himself famously says of that battle, "If this be victory, I pray I never win another." That line alone tells you how costly the so-called victory truly was. The Battle of the Gullet isn't just important because of the spectacle. It reshapes the war emotionally and politically, and if the show captures even a fraction of that weight, it could easily become one of the most powerful episodes of the season. The question is whether they'll lean into the tragedy and chaos of it, or scale it down for practical reasons. Either way, this battle carries enormous narrative consequences. Now, let's properly go over the dragons involved in the Battle of the Gullet. First, Vermax, ridden by Jacaerys Velaryon, plays a central role in the battle. Seasmoke, ridden by Adam Velaryon, is also actively involved. Moondancer, Baela's dragon, takes part as well, and yes, contrary to what some people remember, Baela does participate in this conflict. Tyraxes, the young dragon of Joffrey Velaryon, is sometimes mentioned in relation to the battle, though his involvement is far less significant. So realistically, we're looking at roughly 3 to 4 dragons actively fighting in the chaos above the sea. After the Triarchy launches its devastating surprise assault, the Blacks respond with a counterattack. But before the full strength of their forces engages, Jacaerys Velaryon takes the initiative. He attacks first. He flies directly into the heart of the enemy fleet and begins engaging them almost single-handedly. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra and Daemon's young sons, Aegon the Younger and Viserys, are being sent away to Pentos for safety. As you'll remember, the Prince of Pentos was an ally of Daemon, so the plan is to secure the children there. And this evacuation plan is actually Jacaerys' idea, but fate turns against them. The Triarchy intercepts the ship carrying the boys. Viserys is captured. Aegon barely survives. When Jacaerys realizes that his own plan has led to his brothers falling into enemy hands, he loses control. Overcome with guilt and rage, he dives deeper into the naval battle, flying directly into the mass of enemy ships. And that's where Vermax is ultimately brought down. After Jace's death, the other dragons fully commit to the fight. With Seasmoke and Moondancer continuing the assault, combined with the power of the Velaryon fleet, the Blacks eventually manage to win the battle. But it is a brutal, costly victory. The Battle of the Gullet is technically a win, but emotionally and strategically it's devastating. And that's exactly why Corlys Velaryon famously says, "If this be victory, I pray I never win another." If the show handles this sequence with the proper emotional weight, Jace's recklessness, the burning ship's dragons falling into the sea, this could easily become one of the most tragic and powerful moments of the entire series. In the trailer, we see Rhaenyra pounding on a set of doors in desperation. Most likely, she's been locked inside her chamber. I think what may happen is this: they prevent her from joining the battle on Dragonback. Someone, possibly Jacaerys, might order the doors sealed to stop her from flying into the chaos. And when she realizes what's happening, she loses control, screaming about her sons desperately trying to get out. Because one of the most devastating elements of this battle is the fate of Aegon and Viserys. As we know from the book, the young princes are sent away for safety. During the attack, their ship is intercepted. Viserys is captured. Aegon the Younger, however, manages to mount his dragon, Stormcloud, for the first time. Stormcloud is gravely wounded, but still manages to carry Aegon back to Dragonstone before collapsing. That's how one son survives. But Viserys falls into enemy hands, and everyone believes he is dead. At the same time, Jacaerys dies in the battle, so in a single day, Rhaenyra effectively loses 2 sons, one believed dead, the other confirmed killed. If the show fully includes the younger princes, and it absolutely should, then the emotional consequences of this battle will be enormous. And this is where Rhaena Targaryen could become central. In the book, Rhaena is responsible for escorting the young princes toward Pentos. If the show chooses to emphasize that responsibility, Rhaenyra could very well hold her accountable for what happens. That blame might shift the emotional dynamics significantly. You could even imagine a dramatic restructuring of events in the show. For example, news of the attack arrives while Jacaerys is still in Dragonstone with Rhaenyra. He locks her in her chambers to prevent her from flying into danger. He orders the Kingsguard not to open the doors. Then he flies out alone to try and save his brothers, and dies in the attempt. If that's how they stage it, the guilt and anger could fall heavily on Rhaenyra. And remember, in the book, Rhaenyra's relationship with Daemon becomes strained later, partly because of Nettles. The show might decide to reassign some of that tension to Rhaena instead. That would be a major structural change, but not impossible. At this point, the possibilities are endless. They've already diverged from the source material in several ways, so speculation can go in many directions. The Battle of the Gullet is being heavily hyped, and visually, from what we've seen, it looks strong. But the real questions remain. How long will the battle actually last? How many dragons will truly be involved? How faithfully will the emotional beats be adapted? Will the young prince's storyline unfold exactly as in the book? Will Rainey arrive with Sheep Stealer? We need to see how all of this is executed, because spectacle alone won't carry this moment. The emotional consequences are what will define it. There's also one particular scene in the trailer I want to talk about. There's an unidentified man fighting in what appears to be a town or settlement engulfed in flames. It could be normal fire, but it very much looks like dragon fire. I couldn't immediately place who he is. At the end of the trailer, Daemon says to Rhaenyra, "Now you will be a true queen." That line feels significant. It most likely comes after Jacaerys' death, perhaps in a private conversation where he acknowledges the immense sacrifice she's endured. It could be about loss, about what it truly means to rule, about the cost of power. But there's also the possibility that he says it after she takes the Iron Throne, after she finally sits on it. A promotional image was released, and I personally believe that still comes from the aftermath of Jace's death. However, it could just as easily be from King's Landing itself. The environment in that image looks brighter than Dragonstone, and the walls don't quite match Dragonstone's darker interior aesthetic. So it might actually be inside the Red Keep. Either way, visually, I have to say, the hair design looks fantastic, especially Daemon's. They absolutely nailed that look. Now I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. What are you expecting from Season 3? What did you think about the trailer? Do you believe the Battle of the Gullet will live up to the hype? Let me know your opinions in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.